Okay, we're live. Al, did you want to kick things off?
Do we want to give people a couple minutes? Is everyone here or?
Al, if you want to get started, I'll just keep admitting folks as they arrive.
Okay, all right. Good evening, everyone. Wanted to welcome you to tonight's presentation. We're going to be talking about the Alameda Police Department and their data collection, as well as professional standards and procedures. And we have a number of representatives from the Alameda Police Department who are here to speak to us this evening. I want to express my appreciation for them giving up their time to share this information with us. My name is Al Mance, and I am on the steering committee for the Alameda Police Reform Committee. And just to give you just a quick, for those members of the public who are watching on YouTube who are not familiar with the committee, we have been tasked by the city and the city manager with making some recommendations with regard to the sort of reforms that might help us to change and improve policing in Alameda. We're a small city, in a city in which people know each other and in which we tend to know our public servants as well. This is an additional opportunity for us to get to know them, for us to hear from them. And as the committee moves forward, our intention is to educate ourselves. We're basically made up of residents of Alameda. We are volunteers. We don't have particular expertise in policing. And so what we're doing right now is we're educating ourselves. And we're listening to police officers. We're expressing our concerns to police officers. And our intentions in the future are to listen to the public, have a discourse with the public, and then to take that information, form it into recommendations that we will then take to the city manager and the city council in order to make changes that will improve the practices and performance of our police department. We really appreciate them being here with us tonight, and we look forward to educating ourselves and educating each other. With that, I will turn things over to Sarah Henry, who will be our moderator for this evening.
Thank you, Al. Good evening to the steering committee and the subcommittee members who are here on Zoom and everyone who's watching us on YouTube. I'm Sarah. I'm the city's public information officer, and tonight I'm here to help with the presentation to the subcommittees by the police department about data and professional standards and procedures. Joining us from the Alameda Police Department tonight are Interim Police Chief Randy Fenn, who's been here in Alameda for just 6 weeks, but has over 30 years of service as a police officer and 4 years as chief. Police Captain Matt McMullen, who's been with APD for 18 years and is currently the operations captain, which includes patrol and investigations. Police Captain Jeff Emmett, who's been with APD for 21 years and works opposite Matt in the Services Bureau. Lieutenant Josh Crossley, who has been a police officer for 18 years, 16 and a half here in Alameda, and Josh is assigned to the Patrol Division and is in charge of the Traffic Division. And Lieutenant Ryan Derspini, who has been in law enforcement for 18 years, 16 here in Alameda. And Ryan is the Technical Service Section Commander, and he oversees the Communications Center, Records Division, Identification Bureau, Materials and Acquisitions Unit, and Building and Fleet Maintenance. Following our brief opening remarks, they're all here, all of our speakers, along with Alan Cohen from our city attorney's office to answer as many of your questions as possible. Please note that all the participants have been muted, but steering committee and subcommittee members can submit questions for our speakers at any time by entering them into the chat tool. As I mentioned on Tuesday, over the last few months, the police department has filled 43 information requests from the community-led subcommittees. So if there are any questions about that information, our speakers can answer those as well. Tonight, we do have a hard stop at 8:30, but we'll carry any unanswered questions over to our last meeting on Monday, the 16th. We're streaming this meeting live on YouTube, and then a recorded version will be posted after the meeting ends. I'd now like to ask Police Chief Randy Fenn to kick things off from the police department. And you should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, good. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Al, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for participating again. I'm going to keep my comments even more brief this evening because I know from our experience 2 nights ago, a lot of great questions, and we certainly want to give plenty of time for the question and answer period. So just know that here we are on the second night of what's going to be 3 nights of these forums with kind of a focus on data and our internal services, because there's been a lot of data requests, obviously, and a lot of interest around it. And so we're going to do our best to try where we can to give context to that data and those questions related to it. But I'm going to tell you up front that I think one of the things that we're learning through this process, and it's not just true here in Alameda, but I think it's true throughout law enforcement, and frankly, in many respects throughout government and government service, is that we collect a lot of data. There's a lot of data we don't collect and haven't collected. And then there's a lot of data that we have that we don't know how to extract sometimes from our systems, that sometimes we can get it out, it's incomplete, or we don't know what to do with the numbers. We just see numbers and we're not sure what to do with it. So I just want to tell you that up front, because this is a process for us as well. And we want to have fidelity to this process, to the folks that have volunteered their times from the community to try to help make the city of Alameda and Alameda Police Department better. So we want to do our best to be transparent and to share with you what we can. But again, understanding that there are going to be some limitations, and part of what we've already learned through this process of trying to grab all of this data is where there are holes in our system, where there are holes in our processes, and where we can do better going forward. So with that, we look forward to your questions and do the best we can to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. And then were we going to hear a little bit from everybody again, like last time? I think that was the plan. So I'll turn it over to you, Captain McMullen.
Hi. I feel like I should at least acknowledge the community and those involved in the steering committee and thank them for their time. I appreciate their willingness to give of their time and to provide their valuable insights and views to us as a police department. And we're excited for another night of interaction. It's mainly from us based on the questions, but we are glad to be here again and hope to have a productive night.
Great, thank you. And Captain Emmett?
Good evening, and thank you for having us back. Looking forward to all of the questions that will come through tonight. And I too would also like to thank the steering committees for their time. We do value the community input. In the 21 years that I've been at Alameda, we have always valued our community input, and we are always looking of how we can improve the service that we provide to the community, and plan on continuing that tradition here at APD. I also would like to thank the records unit at Alameda PD. They handled a bulk of the data requests that came through, 43 in total. They were able to fulfill those with still doing their normal day-to-day jobs. And a few of them came in on their days off and stayed late to get those done. So I want to acknowledge them, and our communications center for putting in extra work to pull some of the data that came through the request, and greatly appreciate their dedication to the process as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Lieutenant Crossley?
Good evening. I'd just like to say thank you for everyone on the steering committee. You put the long hours and time and effort into it. Question?
Lieutenant, we're having a little hard time hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we
okay,
can.
Sorry about that.
No
My
worries.
computer's a little messed up with the audio. Just want to say thank you again for your time and effort that you put into this. And questions? The best we can.
Your audio was going out a little bit. I don't know if there's anything,
Yeah.
but I think we got it at the second
Okay.
time. But I don't know if you can switch to headphones. I'm not sure. Okay. So Lieutenant Derek.
Yes, I want to echo the thanks. Obviously, the steering committee, it's a big part of change. Like Mr. Mant said earlier, we live in a small enough town where we can have input, and we're lucky to have the ability to have that input from our community to change as times go on. Obviously, things have to change. I want to echo what Captain Emmett said about the records division, the communications division. Those are my people, and they were working night and day trying to fulfill these requests. So I hope that you folks appreciate the mountains and mountains of requests that we fulfilled, and I hope that it is at least intelligible on the other end. It's not too policey, if you will. Also want to echo what Chief Fenn said in the data. Think of data like a prism. There's a lot of different ways to look at it and a lot of different ways to see what comes out the other side. So bear with us as we try to break down that data and explain that data. And even after we try to do that, some things may not make sense and may not sit well, but that's just the nature of data. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And I have received a couple of questions in advance. So we'll start with those. And then at any time, if a question comes up, you can enter it into the chat and we'll get to those as well. So the first question that has come in is, can you speak to the current crime wave that's been presented via local news outlets? What does the data tell us when we compare 2018 to 2019 to 2020? And is the current crime data consistent with past economic downturns? Chief, do you want to start with that one?
I'm going to give just a quick overview of crime numbers. It's the first part after all this discussion about that. It's the good launching point, I guess. We have to be a little careful with numbers. They tell part of the story, and that is, yes, we need to watch and we need to know when crime is increasing, decreasing, and then try to look for those reasons why. But there are multiple factors to why crime increases and decreases, and I always joke about the role of a police chief. It's almost like an NBA coach. You get too much credit when they win and too much blame when the team loses. I feel like sometimes we get too much credit when crime goes down and too much blame when crime goes up. With that, there's no doubt that there's been this uptick, especially in the shootings, and that's really what the recent news reports were about, and that's why we wanted to come to the community and kind of say, look, we acknowledge this is happening. This seems to be part of, unfortunately, both a regional and national phenomenon that we are seeing in many communities, not the least of which is next door in Oakland. Look down 80 to Vallejo and others, you're seeing significant increases in especially violent crime and shootings in particular. So we're looking at those, and then we try to take the numbers and then dig behind those numbers and find out, what connections we can make, what investigative leads, what things that we can do proactively to prevent them. Because the other thing I always say about data is we can get excited when the numbers go down, but we have to remember that behind every one of those numbers is a victim, and we have to put the victim first. We have to get justice for the victim, helps the victim seek justice, help bring people to justice who have committed these crimes. So that's kind of the big picture, if you will, with crime numbers. And then I'm going to kick it to one of the captains, I believe, has got the year-over-year numbers that we can talk more specifically about the trend that we're seeing this year and over 2019 and 2018 as well. Or maybe not.
They both should be unmuted. Captain Emmett or Captain McMullen?
I don't have the numbers in front of me. Perhaps Captain Emmett does, but if I could briefly just echo what the chief said in regards to numbers. I've done some recent research into crime waves. There is a plethora of information about the great crime drop, as it is called often, over the last 40 years or so. And the reasons behind that, I will echo that there's lots of causation and correlations and theories from criminologists from the far East Coast out here in California, and some very astute scholars who have written volumes of literature on this very thing. And we'll say that it is difficult to analyze, especially in real time. We do our best to address those crimes as they do come in and come up with strategies, time-proven strategies that have been known to help quell these incidents, to prevent them, and then not only that, to solve them when they do occur. I will follow suit with Captain Emmett and Lieutenant Daraspini in thanking our crime investigators, both as patrol officers and in our investigative unit. They do a phenomenal job tracking down all leads, exhausting all investigative leads, and presenting the best cases possible to the district attorney's office when they do occur. And we are committed to those values moving into the future.
Thank you. Captain Emmett, did you want to add to that?
No, I don't want to belabor it. It's I agree with everything that Chief Fenn and Captain McMullen presented.
Okay, great. Chief Fenn, the next question is for you. The question is, did Fairfield keep more comprehensive statistics than Alameda? And what changes would you make to Alameda's data collection practices based on your experiences in other jurisdictions?
Okay, I guess I just need to not mute.
Oh, there you
anymore.
go.
I'll stay unmuted. Okay.
Sorry.
Yes. Fairfield was fortunate enough to have a certified crime analyst, and that was tremendously helpful because we had someone that was their full-time job. And in fact, sometime in early 2019, late 2018, 2019, we actually created a crime intel unit that had the crime analyst and then a detective assigned to that unit, so that they could cull data in a much faster rate. And we had software that allowed both commanders and supervisors in the field to get real-time crime data as well, so we could have what's called hotspot policing, so that we knew not right down to the address with GPS data where crimes had occurred over the previous 24, 48, and on, so that we could more accurately, or more focused rather, deploy patrol resources in particular. So I'm not going to say it was perfect, but it was a pretty good system, and it was certainly the direction that much of law enforcement is trying to go. I know that my understanding is there was a crime analyst here at the Alameda Police Department, and through the economic downturn, the Great Recession, that position was lost. And I've already made mention, just kind of in passing, to the city manager and others that, as we have been trying to work through all these data requests, that really having a crime analyst, and it's such a specialized field now. I mean, there's full bachelor degree and master's degree programs in universities. Sacramento has Cal State Sacramento has a pretty robust program. And there's a lot of people coming out of college that are ready to jump right in and take on the data. And then so it's a matter of the person to call the data, and then of course the right software to be able to use it with GIS mapping and some of those things. So I think long-term, I think the results of this committee and the work, these committees and the work that they're doing, I think we're going to want to take a real long, hard look at that as a city and as a police department.
Great. And two quick follow-up questions for that. Somebody just asked, what is the population of Fairfield compared to Alameda?
The unreported number is 117. I think they're expecting at the end of the census to be 120. Yeah. Okay,
great. And then another person asked, what software were you talking about? And they referenced Palantir or something else?
There's a number. We use CrimeView Dashboard, was the one that had the interface for those in the field, for the officers could look at their particular beat, and then the supervisors and managers could monitor as well.
Okay, great. So then the next question is, they ask about 25% of Part 2 crimes that were reported by APD in 2019 were categorized as all other. Is there a reason why the department has not specified the type of these crimes? Do you want me to go to?
I can start, and then Lieutenant DeRuspini might be able to jump in and help me out. So those data points are set by Department of Justice, and the crimes that we have that don't fall into a specific category that is set by DOJ fall into the other part.
Captain McMullen, did you want to add, or is that?
No, I think that's sufficient. I can add that the way we are collecting data will soon change. The universal crime reporting that has been established since the 1930s is switching to a national incident-based reporting system, short-term called NIBRS, and that collects far more data points than universal crime reporting. So in the next few years, there's going to be some monumental changes that occur within our organization, specifically on how we collect and report data as it relates to criminal activity within the city.
Okay. The next question is, in a world where data is utilized in all industries and organizations, both public and private, what structures and systems are in place at APD to use the data to make decisions, and what examples of decisions that are made from data insights?
I can speak on that.
Okay, great.
So that comes back to having a dedicated crime analyst. When I first started my career in APD in 2004, it was not uncommon to have your traditional police drama pin map of where crimes had occurred and directing resources to those crimes. In addition to that, with staffing numbers back then, which was 110 or 111, I don't remember which it was, there were proactive units dedicated specifically to crime suppression for those areas. So they would take direct data-driven reports and go focus on those areas. Another place you see that come into play is with traffic collisions and enforcement around scenes of traffic collisions. And also when we used to do DUI checkpoints, which we have not done in several years, that had to be completely data-driven. But without having a crime analyst to specifically nail that data down, you can get the information, much like the steering committee got the information, by asking our records division to run a report based on one of our record management systems and come up with crime trends. But it's a really surface level dive into what creates crimes in those areas and how you would be able to direct resources to lower crime in those areas. I hope that helps.
Great. And Matt, somebody had asked, based on your comments earlier about the data, somebody had asked, for example, what new data will be captured? If you could just elaborate a little bit on that.
Without going into the nuances, I'll just speak to, and these are rough numbers, so don't hold me strictly accountable to the exact number, but UCR collects based on roughly 8 or so points of data as far as part 1, part 2 crimes, and that's why you get the banks of all others. The NIBRS system, which is, you can Google it and it will show up. We're going to be collecting far more points of data as it relates to the victims' demographics, the suspect demographics, and then right now there's a hierarchy. So if a crime is committed, it gets the UCR code for the highest or the most egregious crime within that subset, but NIBRS will capture all of them and report them all to the DOJ. So I hope that on a broad brush kind of paints a little bit better of a picture. Every crime that is reported within one particular incident will be captured rather than just the most egregious crime.
And just to add real quickly, I believe the last count that they were up to, because it's changed over the last 6 months or so, is 54 data points that will be now reported to DOJ with NIBRS instead of the 8 to 12 that we currently report with UCR. That goes into effect January 1st of this year. And we have been doing training with all of our employees for the past several months, getting everyone prepared, especially those in our records unit, to get ready for the transition. when that first month or two of data comes out, it's going to look extremely different from what we produce now. So there's going to be some questions. We realize that, and we'll do the best that we can to explain as those new data sets come out what it means overall. And there's ways that we should be able to make comparable references to the old UCR reporting system so that there's some comparisons early on before we are able to have 5, 6, 7 months of data to show.
Thank you. And the next person asked, what are the clearance rates for violent crime? And this question came up during when the captain was talking about investigations and the work of APD. Matt or Jeff, do you want to take this one?
So it looks like Jeff might be looking up the data.
Okay.
As he does so, I will give a broad brush of sometime. I don't want to say it depends. I know that that's a too vague of an answer. There's lots of values and inputs that go into the possibility and probabilities of crimes being cleared. And they're different among sets of property crimes where someone wakes up and finds 4 cars broken into the next morning, or a car broken into with no suspect information, versus other types of crimes where there might be several witnesses to that particular event. Oftentimes crimes against persons, there's usually a person, if no one else, the victim, to provide some intelligence on the perpetrator, which helps us capture them.
I have the year-to-date stats through September. October's have not been published yet, but clearance rates for Part 1 crimes for year-to-date is 8.4%. And then for Part 2 crimes, it's 40%. And then total overall crime clearance rates is 22.1%.
Thank you. Back to the previous question, Captain Emmett, somebody asked, and Captain McMullen, you both spoke about this, but somebody asked, how will you at APD use the new data that you're going to be receiving?
NIBRs?
Yes.
So I think it's still yet to be determined how the additional data points really play into the day-to-day operations. That's part of the training and part of the analysis that will have to happen after the first several months, because it is so different. We are going to have to really figure out how the reporting looks, not just on paper, but comparing that to the crimes that we're investigating, the calls for service, and some other data sets that we currently use with UCR. So I don't know is the answer, and it's going to take some time to figure out.
Okay.
And really going back to the types of data that we collect, I mean, we look at those numbers, but they don't have nearly the impact for operations that address information, person information that's connected with those crimes. When you talk about it, again, painting with a broad brush, we talk about a place like Chicago that has infamously had lots of shootings and violent crime that they've been dealing with. When they actually break that down, it is 1 to 2 police precincts, police areas that have the biggest problem. And when you look in those in particular precincts, you can narrow that down with GIS data to small areas of the city that have the biggest amount of problem. And really that is the future of policing, going back to having that data more real-time available to police officers and to police commanders, so that resources are more focused on exactly where they're needed. And that's where, you talk about what are fair criticisms of the police, and I'm sure there's plenty on this call tonight of people that have their criticisms of the police. And one I can absolutely tell you is that we have not done a good job historically using data and being data driven, and that is definitely the future, so that when a police officer is in a neighborhood, that we're not casting this broad net, making lots of stops, which we run into our own problems with, understandably so, but being able to focus those resources much more like a scalpel, moving in exactly where those problem areas are, those problem houses are. Because sometimes when you look at, say, an apartment complex, it's 1 or 2 apartments that have the problem or are that generate most of the calls for service out of this area. And then when you look at it, well, you find out you have, a problem son, a parolee who got out of prison and moved back in on his grandmother or something who can't control him, and now this become this source of problems. Well, we would rather know that information and direct police resources there than look like we're just patrolling neighborhoods and everything have this kind of randomness to the patrol and to the outcomes. So where those criticisms are about us using data as a profession, and certainly as an Alameda Police Department, we hear you, and that is definitely the direction we want to go.
The next question is asking if APD collects data on the race and gender of people whom APD officers have contact. So arrests and also additional contact.
That is a data collection point on all of our forms that we use to document calls for service, whether it's a crime report, miscellaneous report, incident card, field interview card. But that data is not always captured for many different reasons. Sometimes people are not comfortable giving that type of information. Sometimes the officers forget to fill it in. So yes, we do collect it, but it's as good as any other data set. If it's filled in, if it's categorized, if it's captured on the back end.
Great.
And I don't know if this is premature to bring it up about RIPA, the Racial Identity and Profiling Act of California, AB 953, which is on the horizon as well. And it looks like Lieutenant Derspini was also going to make comments on it. Just so everyone's aware, again, you could Google this. This is something that we will be reporting in 2023. But there are some things on the horizon in which we will gather more data as time progresses on each individual contact or detention that we have with individuals within the city of Alameda to comply with the law.
I also think it's worth noting that along those lines and what the chief was saying about being slow to use data, we're in the middle of a transition to a new report management system and computer assisted dispatch system that will have both the AB 953 RIPA data integrated into it and a very robust GIS mapping software integrated into it. So especially even speaking to a panel of people looking for some sort of reform, we are very slow to upgrade technology and the city government side of things, but we are moving that direction. For a quick example, in the last 10 years, which is a pretty common snapshot of data when people request data from the police department, if you were to request things from 2010 until 2020, you would have handwritten police reports, one vendor that we use for an automated reporting system, our current vendor, and a vendor we're transitioning to in February. So collecting that data, maintaining that data, and ensuring its accuracy is very difficult, but we are actively working on changing that now.
And then, Sarah, if I could just add one more thing about the RIPA data that Captain McMullen talked about. I think it's important for people to know that all of the data that's collected through RIPA, the officers who make those contacts are not allowed to ask the individual that they are contacting the questions. It is all based on officers' perceptions. So again, data in, data out, I think that's something for folks to keep in mind when they start looking at RIPA data.
That means all demographic information.
Right.
It's perceived race, perceived sexual orientation, perceived ethnicity. That's written into the law. That's how it has to be.
Right.
And just a follow up, we talked about that it's about the data that folks are looking for is the data on race and gender of people whom APD officers have contact with, not just people that have been arrested. But one of the things you said was how that sometimes officers fail to collect it. And so the question was just roughly how often is that the case? Is there a way to know that?
I don't have the numbers off the or with me. I would say that they're not that high as far as the number of times that data is not filled in.
Okay.
It would be the kinds of situations where an officer takes a phone report, for instance, and doesn't make physical contact. I mean, you can't book somebody without filling in that information, but it doesn't mean you're going to fill it in every time you're talking to a victim or a witness or some other party involved in something. It just, sometimes you're just not even going to see them to know any of that demographic data.
Okay.
The court system will not enter a citation or an arrest report without at least a race and gender in the box. So as far as that question goes for enforcement purposes, it's almost impossible to get a piece of paper through the court system without race and gender.
Next question. This person would like to know why data sets that are collected on the LGBTQ community and other marginalized groups are not reported like the data sets on race and gender. What response can be given for neglecting to report data on these groups, considering that the department uses identifiers on gender and race?
Well, again, most of those things have not been collected. They have not been categorized or held out beyond gender, and which was traditional to report it as binary. And now, of course, in California, it can be non-binary when you get a driver's license. And so all of the data sets, or all of the software and the things that we record that data in have been slow to change as well. So I think some of that will change over time, but some of that information just has never been part of what we have collected unless it was directly germane to a crime for some reason.
Okay. Next question. Does APD have a mechanism to share data with other city departments?
We'd have to know a lot more about what that data is, I think.
Right.
I used to represent the city from the police side on the Vision Zero task force, and it was not uncommon to share citation, collision, all kinds of data across the table with engineering, the city manager's office and such. It's just a simple request. But again, there is protected information when it comes to open investigations, personnel investigations, and that protected information is obviously run through the city attorney's office for review before releasing anything too sensitive.
Okay. Next question. Does APD currently impose any sorts of quotas? This was actually this was talked about a little bit on Tuesday night, but just to say it again, does APD currently impose any sorts of quotas on officers with regards to stops? And has this been a practice within APD during your time here, to those folks that have been here for quite a bit?
No.
Okay.
Quotas are illegal under California law.
Okay. All right. The next question. At the first forum, it was stated that carotid holds are not allowed. The data that you've provided said that there were 5 carotid holds between 2014 and 2019. How were those 5 holds evaluated?
So I'll tackle that the best I can. If a carotid hold is applied, whether or not it was successful or not, it falls under our use of force policy, which it had to be, or it should have been reported, which if we have the data, it was reported. And then that would have been reviewed like any other use of force. It would have been a sergeant responding to the scene, making sure that that person received the proper medical care, and then up the chain of command from the sergeant to a defensive tactics instructor, to the lieutenant, to the captain, to the chief. And every step of the way, body-worn camera footage reviewed, statements from the suspect who was taken into custody if they chose to give one, police reports, photographs, and all the like would have been looked at, reviewed to make sure that everything that we did was within the confines of our policy and the law, and corrective action along the way if need be.
Okay. Going back to the question that we talked about before with regards to when we don't have when the data hasn't been reported, this person asked, what about situations when someone is stopped but not cited or arrested? They think that it would be useful to know how often people are stopped but not cited, because these are often the people who are feeling harassed.
Yeah, those anytime someone is stopped, they are on a traffic stop. At least now they have a written warning, which mirrors almost all the information that a moving violation does. The difference being that it's kept internal for data collection and not sent to the court for prosecution or any fines. That is a practice that we've had in place now. I want to say it was around COVID time. but definitely a 2020 implementation. Before that, on a car stop, when you would clear a car stop without a citation, you would have to report the driver's race, age, either juvenile or adult, and sex as well, and then say that you were giving a warning. That was done over the radio. So we've tightened that up into a written warning system. And then to go one step further, RIPA is going to encompass all stops, not just traffic stops, in collection of that data to be forwarded to DOJ on an annual basis. And we are to start reporting in 2023.
And then are you now, or will you, with the new policy or the new practices, be collecting demographic data on people with disabilities?
Don't think that's one of the categories.
No.
And then regarding carotid holds, were those holds performed while they were against policy, or what corrective actions have been taken if they were outside of that policy?
So I could speak to the carotid hold that it was in our policy until recently when Governor Newsom signed, I believe it was an executive order. I hope I'm not misspeaking in that regard, where they decertified it from the post curriculum, the police officer standards and training. And at that time, it was immediately removed from our policy. And no longer authorized for use. And to my knowledge, none have been reported since it was unauthorized.
Got it.
Hey, Sarah, can I make a quick clarification?
Please. Yeah, please.
Thankfully, the internet is right here. Part of the RIPA data that we will be collecting is perceived or known disability of the person stopped. So I guess we will be tracking that very soon.
Great. Thank you, Chief. Next question. Is APD open to collecting and publicizing data that tracks police stops, use of force data, and conducting qualitative surveys with the community that differentiate the portion of racial disparities that police can't control, for example, poverty? And then in addition, is the department open to collaborating with outside organizations that specialize in data for equity models to further increase transparency?
Jeff, you want to talk about what we're working on?
Yes, sir. So a couple of months ago, we reached out to the Center for Police Equity group, who is, I believe, funded through grants and through research through, I believe it's Yale. What's nice is they will take all of your data that you can supply to them, and they will do an independent analysis. They will then give you a report that can be used internally within the department to analyze your data and to see what changes that you would be interested in making. They also supply a report that would be given to the city that city council and the city manager's office could look at and review. And then they also make a report that's available to the public. The nice thing with the Center for Police Equity is that it is a free service. It is something that we're exploring. We're in the early stages of getting those kinks worked out. As soon as our new CAD and our RMS system is up and running, I'm assuming that process will kind of start moving along. But I'm sure, just like most other data review companies, the Center for Police Equity is pretty busy right now. There's a lot of agencies that are reaching out to them to analyze their data, but we do plan on working with them in the near future and getting that up and running.
Great. Next question is asking if the demographic data that we've been discussing, is that data available to the public?
Well, yeah, most of it is. We currently don't have mechanisms though for just posting it. So it's the kind of information that, depending on exactly what it is, would have to be requested.
Got it. And then the next question is, how is APD preparing for collecting or already collecting data required by the Racial and Identity Profile Act? This person specifically is asking about reasons for stop, weighted residential population compared to stop data, and the veil of darkness analysis.
Yeah, we're ready to comply with that, and as we make the transition that was mentioned earlier to a new vendor for records management, they have a module in the software that they'll be giving us. We'll be able to directly comply with RIPA through our new software.
Great.
Which we, again, just a reminder that under law we will be complying in 2023.
And next question, how will data be used if it shows a specific police officer has more use of force or escalated incidents with people of a certain race? How will that data about the officer's actions be used?
Do you want to talk about, Jeff, about any early intervention and some of those things, blue team and some of that?
Yeah, and then Lieutenant Crossley, please feel free to jump in if I miss anything. So like we talked about on Tuesday, with our early warning system that tracks all of our use of force incidents, they are set at a certain level, and when that level is reached, it'll send you an alert or a reminder that officer has had so many involvements in use of force, and it requires us to take an additional look to make sure that we didn't miss anything the first time around. But like Captain McMullen has talked about tonight, and then on Tuesday, this past Tuesday, every use of force incident is reviewed at multiple levels, starting with the field supervisor and working its way through the chain of command of the that officer works for. And then on the other side, it's, we talked about reviewing the body worn camera footage. That is done on a random basis as well, not just with use of force incidents. And we're always looking for ways that we can improve our customer service through that as well.
Can I just add something too on that, Sarah? Just a little bit of context so that everybody understands. A department the size of Alameda, it's not like we have hundreds of police officers and dispersed throughout a huge city. So the reality of it is, it would be unusual for someone to have multiple uses of force without it being known to the command staff. There might be nuances, there might be individual instances that aren't known, but the good news is we have the warning system, we have the system in place, but it's also, we have word of mouth and the ability to know all of our employees, know all of our officers, and know what's happening on the street day by day. So when you look at 25 to 30 reportable uses of force, and that really covers the gamut of from really, really small intervention to higher level uses of force. It's not that hard for us to know what's going on, and that's, as a manager, as a boss, I'm certainly thankful that that's the case.
Great. And at the last meeting, we talked about policies. And so this person is asking a question that I think we touched on last time, but I'll just ask again for a brief answer. They ask, how are updates made to departmental policies? What level of research is required to justify or trigger a change in policy? Are there preferred research organizations whose research is used to set policy? Does the department seek out this research proactively or only in response to an incident?
So as we mentioned in the last meeting about using the service Lexipol and relying on their staff of attorneys and other experts who regularly, again, keep an eye on court case decisions, changes in the legislature, and as well as looking for best practices. And so that is the best research, an ongoing and timely research, I think, that helps drive policy. But we also pay attention to what's happening locally, to trends that are happening. And just because Lexipol has addressed something or hasn't addressed something does not preclude us from writing our own policies creating our own policy specific to the needs of the Alameda Police Department, the city of Alameda, and the community that we serve. So the good news is with a service like Lexipol, again, team of attorneys keeping on top of it so that it's timely, but it does not preclude us, especially as a management team, from constantly looking for ways to improve our own operation.
Great, thank you for that. Captain Emmett, somebody has asked if the Center for Police Equity that you spoke about, if they've returned any of the reports on the data that APD has sent them.
No, we haven't sent any data yet. We're still in the process finalizing an agreement to work with them.
Okay. Next question is, what is the procedure for following up on incidents that generate a police report? Does any member of the department reach out to the victim or witnesses to gather demographic information or feedback on police performance?
So I'll speak briefly to it. As far as the demographic information that typically is collected when the primary officer responds to investigate. In regards to follow-up, our investigations unit does follow up on many of the crimes and connects folks with resources. I'll provide an example such as domestic violence. We refer them to a domestic violence center where they can continue to get resources or help through their victimization and ways to heal and move on from those incidents. It's one of the goals that we've set as a police department to make sure that we're following up with folks and making sure that we are providing that service that we want to provide to the community. But the short answer is yes, we follow up on many of the crimes, and the demographic data is typically jotted down during the initial investigation.
Okay. If a bystander notices use of force that seems inappropriate, what is the best way to find out who the involved officers are in order to report that?
So the best thing to do would be to call the police department directly. They can speak with a supervisor, give all the data, all the information that the caller can about the location, what was seen, and all that, and that allows us to quickly grab that information, find out where this happened, what's happened, and launch an investigation if need be right there. So the best thing to do is just call the police department, ask to talk to a supervisor. Okay. 24/7.
Talking about the changes to data collection in the systems, can you give more specific timelines about when those changes are going to be implemented? That has the only timeline that's been mentioned is compliance that's required in 2023. So when is it going to start being implemented?
Okay, so our new record management system, which is going to change the way that we complete police reports and at least gather initial data for police reporting, that is supposed to go live in spring. Obviously, there's a lot of hardware and software upgrades that go with that, as well as training not just the report writers, the police officers, but also the call takers and dispatchers in our communication center, and then our records folks as well to manage the data on the back end, because it's a new report writing system, new record management system, and new computer assisted dispatch system all at once. That will happen in March, hopefully in March. I probably just jinxed it. It's probably gonna be May or June now, but hopefully in March that kicks off. Once that goes into play, they have an embedded system to capture our RIPA data. The RIPA data, we do not have to report until 2023, but we will start collecting it as early as 2022 so we can turn in our annual report. That is embedded in the record management system that we've purchased. I hope that was detailed enough.
That's great. Going back to the asking about if you have see somebody and there's in that like use of force seems inappropriate or anything else, is there a way to file a complaint online, or do you need to call the police department? Oh, Josh, you should be able to unmute yourself. Now try.
There we go. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, you can, there's a few ways you can do it. You can usually start by calling our dispatch and ask them to speak to a supervisor, the on-duty supervisor, sergeant. That'll start the process going. And then there's ways you can come to the station and we have a form, a personnel complaint form. that you can be given and filled out and turned back in. Or you can have the sergeant email you or refer you to the internal affairs or the inspectional services sergeant, who can then also get in contact with that person and get them the form they need to fill out.
Great, thank you.
And then Sarah, the form's
Yeah.
also available on the website. People can find it there as well.
Great. Thank you both for that. The next person says, as a resident of the city of Alameda, in their observations, it seems that the Alameda Police Department is lacking diversity. Is there something that can be taken into consideration and addressed in the future for hiring APD officers and staff?
Yeah, I'll start. You know, we talked about this in the last meeting as well. And am I still working there?
Yeah, you're great.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, that trying to diversify is absolutely a goal and a desire of the police department, of the city. And I think we are all struggling, not just law enforcement, not just city government, but many walks of life business. I thought about it after the meeting the other night. You know, Major League Baseball is trying to diversify, diversify in ownership and in management. So this is a societal issue that we're all trying to tackle, understand, and improve upon. So we are also trying to hire people directly from the city of Alameda. We want people who grew up here, who have that connection with the city, who love it and know it best, and will do its best to take care of it. So that is an important part of what we do. And I don't know if Jeff, you want to talk a little bit about our actual recruitment efforts and the things that we do as well.
Yeah, just to reiterate what we talked about on Tuesday night, that we're always looking to recruit those folks that have that personal connection to Alameda, like Chief was talking about. And then, you know, we want our police department to be a reflection of what our community is. And, you know, we do try to recruit as much as we can locally, but so is every other law enforcement agency in the Bay Area. And that's where the challenges lie, is trying to find folks that want to work in law enforcement to begin, and then you know, trying to encourage those who live and work in our communities that they want to come work for Alameda. So yeah, it's a challenge, and it's been a challenge for about the last, I'd say, 8 to 10 years.
And I know one of the subjects for the Monday night forum is going to look at its budget and staffing. So we can talk more about that then as well. The next question is, what happens when the complaints are filed? Is immediate action taken? In this person's experience, the responses vary from no action taken, an investigation put on the back burner, to immediate suspension based on agency.
So when a personnel complaint is filed, it's passed up through the chain of command. Once it reaches through the chain of command, is reviewed by the chain, it'll go down to the inspectional services sergeant, who's in charge of investigating the incident. He will then take a look at the complaint, try to identify some policy violations or whatever it may be that the complainant was talking about. Usually reach back out to the complainant to get a little more information, maybe clarify a few things. And then they will pull in what we call an IA number, an investigation number, and start the complaint process or the investigation process, which includes interviewing witnesses, watching body camera, collecting evidence, kind of just like a police investigation, except on a internal side. Once that investigation is completed, there's 4 different findings that the inspectional services supervisor can find, which is sustained, not sustained, exonerated, or unfounded. With a sustained finding of a violation or violations, a report will be completed. Well, a report will be completed regardless, but if there's a sustained finding, there will be a recommendation for a discipline review board, which is put together by the chief. where they sit down and looked over what the violations were. If this officer or whoever it is had prior violations of the same thing, stuff like that. And then the chief will determine the level of punishment, which can be anything from a written reprimand all the way up to termination, just depending on what it is.
Josh, 2 follow-up questions to that. Does the chief see every complaint that comes in? And then also, what is the timeline on the investigation of complaints?
Yes, the chief will see every complaint that does come in. The timeline will vary depending on the depth of the investigation. Usually I'd say probably about 3 to 6 months, but could take anywhere up to a year. It just depends on the investigation and how much has to be done.
So what would happen to an officer while the complaint is pending?
It just depends on what the violation is.
Okay. Great. Next question is, as part of the committee's work, they're considering avenues to address the community's needs from its public safety officers. In other words, they're trying to figure out what ways the community relies on the police and other city services. What information does the police department gather that would be helpful for this effort? They have calls for service, but can you think of other data or aggregated sources of information that would be helpful?
I think calls for service is probably the best way for folks to get an idea of what it is we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Every single call that comes into the police department is categorized in those calls for service logs, from a crime that's being reported to a person who's been locked out of their car or locked out of their home, to someone who can't start their car, to someone who needs help with directions. All of those would be logged in our call for service.
Yeah, I think that really is the best place. It's certainly the best place to start, because it gives you that feel for what does the community call the police for? What kinds of services? And I would argue that if you wanted to branch out from that and look at what EMS and the fire department gets called for, because there's oftentimes a connection or a corollary, the use of emergency services in the hospital, because oftentimes there's a connection. So I think you look at, if you want to look at the issues society is dealing with, the problems that tend to affect, that spill out, society has to deal with it. You got to look at it somewhat holistically. And it's kind of like what we talked about the other night. Part of the problem is we always answer the phone, and I'm not trying to be glib, but 24/7, there's always someone that's going to answer the phone at the police department, and we have the ability to send people to try to deal with problems that maybe we don't want the police dealing with, or we'd like to find another entity. But a lot of times those other entities don't exist. So I think you have to look at the broad range of issues that society has to deal with, from mental illness to addiction to poverty to homelessness, all of those things. And then you can start to look at, well, what part of this societal problem is the police department dealing with? What part of it is the fire department, EMS, again, hospitals, other governmental and non-governmental agencies? I think that's the best way. If you're going to make decisions on what you want the police to do and not do, you really have to take a holistic approach to a lot of these societal issues.
And then,
Thank you, Chief.
Sarah, if I could just add something real quick. I didn't appreciate this much when I was a brand new officer 20 years ago. But you will not find many other agencies out there that will send a police officer to your home at 3 o'clock in the morning because a possum is trapped in your fireplace, or you've been locked out of your home, or you've been locked out of your car, or you need help taking your groceries in. There are not a lot of agencies that can respond. Fortunately, here in Alameda, we can. And, as I've gotten older and I have a family of my own, I want my family to live in a area where they have a police agency like APD that will respond to those things. And I think when you look at the 70,000 calls for service that we get a year, a lot of those, not a lot, some of those they're not police calls, but thankfully we work in a community where we can go to someone's home at 3 o'clock in the morning and help them get a possum out of their fireplace. Because vector control is not going to come at 3 o'clock in the morning. I can promise you that, but we will. And I think even though it may not be a police related call, I'm glad that we are able to send this officer to a resident's home to help them with that problem.
Great. Thank you, Captain. When we started putting together this speaker series, we had 6 topics identified. And so we set up 3 meetings and we would address 2 topics in each meeting. And so this meeting, we were talking about data, which we've talked about for the first hour or so. And then now we're moving on to professional standards and procedures. And I have still a few questions that have come in, and some of them are about data. So I'm going to continue to ask the questions that have been asked already. But if you have questions about standards and procedures and you want to ask those for the folks that are on the call, this would be the perfect time. But the next question that has come in is asking about the computer terminals that feature in every officer's vehicle. Do those keep data of any kind?
So those computers that are inside of the police cars, they are just like a desktop computer. The programs that we use to take police reports, all of that information filters back to the same location. We have servers that house all of the reports that we take, the information that's collected. So whether it's from like a detective's desktop computer or what we would call a mobile data terminal, which are the computers that are in the cars, it all filters back to the same place. Nothing is physically stored on the computer itself.
The next question, there's vacuuming. I was all distracted. Okay. The next question is asking the chief, and I'm sure we'd love to hear from the captains too. But if you're in favor of unbundling services, and which services would you like to see removed from police calls?
Well, again, I think we need to be careful about it and take a holistic approach. But I fully recognize, one, how expensive police services are. As someone who has to have ultimate responsibility for the budget, I certainly understand that. I also understand we are not necessarily the most efficient or effective entity to handle some of the problems that have been thrust upon us or that we're asked to handle. So I think it would be absolute arrogance on my part, on the part of law enforcement in general, to say, no, we're going to do it all, and we don't want to change or be open to that change. But having said that, having looked at it, and even before the current this current discussion that we've had nationally since May, for the last several years, I have been in different venues, speaking with both state legislators, county mental health professionals, nonprofit leaders, talking about some of the, again, societal issues that have been thrust upon us as police, that such as homelessness, mental illness, addiction, where there are definitely better approaches, but they don't always exist. And they certainly don't exist in the ability to respond when the emergency is happening or the crisis is happening, especially after hours, middle of the night, and all of that. So I am absolutely in favor, in principle, of taking a long, hard look at police services like we're doing here, and recognizing that there are more efficient ways and probably better ways to handle some of society's issues and problems other than the police. And I think we would be more than happy to give many of those responsibilities up and help another entity handle those things. But by and large, and there are exceptions, and there are growing exceptions throughout the country, and I think it's important that we take a look at them. But most of those do not exist as we speak here tonight in our area, unfortunately.
Thank you. The next two questions are related to the budget, which is the topic for Monday night. So I'm going to save these for them, but I wanted to read them now. First, the question asked, can you provide details on how the department spends its money? We requested detailed budget information and received the publicly available one-page summary. Second, how much money does the department spend on training annually? Who is this paid to? How much of this is grant funded and how much is taxpayer funded? So both of those questions we'll have in the queue for Monday.
Stay tuned.
Yes. The next question is, this person has concerns with the statement made the other night regarding the police shooting at a moving vehicle. What are the current standards where that would be acceptable? And would the person have to be shooting at the officer or attempting to ram into the officer?
I'll start, and please, the others, feel free to jump in. I made that comment the other night, and I want people to understand that that is a last resort for us. For any shooting to occur as a last resort, not just at a vehicle, but any shooting. What I was trying to convey, and maybe I didn't do a good enough job of making my point, is policy currently allows us to do that. And I would hate for any policy to say that you shall not be able to use a tool that could potentially save somebody's life. And that was the point I was trying to make, is it is not something we encourage our employees to go out there and do. We talk about how dangerous that it is, and that it's not always the most effective method, but it could be a method that could bring a stop to a horrific event that's occurring. We hopefully next year we'll be able to all partake in the mayor's 4th of July parade again. And, I know Captain McMullen talked about, we have certain things in place for the worst day, for the safety net. And I would hate for our officers not to be able to stop a vehicle from driving into the mayor's parade. Because it said that they shall not shoot at a moving vehicle. Again, it's not something we encourage. It's not something that that we would take lightly, like any other shooting.
Got it. Next question is asking, can you tell us the procedures for responding to a mental health crisis call? How many officers respond? What's the average time of the call? Do you transport people who are 5150'd, and what happens with folks who are in crisis but don't meet the 5150 criteria?
Matt, you want to handle that?
Yes, sir. So typically, any call that has the potential for violence or officer safety will typically send 2 patrol officers to any of those calls. As opposed to a call such as someone broke into my car and last night and they're no longer here, we might send 1, but typically we send 2. But some of that's based on the information that the caller provides, if they're armed, if they're mobile. So lots of factors play into what our response looks like, from the initial call to dispatch to what officers observe when they first arrive, the number of people at the scene, the accessibility to weapons, and so on and so forth. Once they get there, we try to utilize all the resources we have at our disposal to the best that we can. Without getting into the details, Lieutenant Daraspini and I just this year went to a call where we had the time to slow things down, and we actually called a mobile crisis unit to come out to help us resolve the very tricky situation that we found ourselves in. Knowing that we have to do whatever we can to protect life is always at the foremost of our minds. With that, when people don't meet the qualifications for a 5150 detention, because we do take restricting someone's civil liberties very seriously, we'll try to provide resources to them to get them help, whether it be a mobile crisis unit, whether it be take them to the hospital. And to answer the last portion of the question before I forget is we typically will call the fire department who does our transportation of our 5150 detentions to the facility most appropriate for their crisis. Oftentimes there's a medical component, a physical medical component to what's going on, and they determine where they need to go to help them the best initially, and then the disposition typically is to John George Pavilion. But there's some factors that play into that too, as far as age and appropriate levels of care. We also work with some other entities where we can provide referrals after the fact if they don't meet that 5150 criteria. We have a great relationship with the Alameda Family Services and other folks that we will sometimes make referrals to and work with in subsequent times if someone needs help that just doesn't meet the criteria.
Can you explain a little bit about what a mobile crisis unit is?
I have limited knowledge, but they have some folks who came out, I know, for our incident, and they had mental health professionals who helped guide us through the best appropriate responses that supplemented our training through crisis intervention training. And they also provide additional resources. Sometimes they have formed better alliances and relationships with mental health providers in the area where we can get some more information on patients, especially if we can grab some intel on their history, which often helps better serve the incident. The more we know, the better off we are to provide the appropriate response and service.
And is that with the behavioral health department at the county?
It looks like Lieutenant Daraspini would also like to chime in.
So yeah, they are trained through the behavioral health department within the county. They are assigned to assist law enforcement in incidents. What I will say as a caveat to that is they will not directly negotiate with the person in crisis at this point. And they will obviously not go knock on someone's door to quote unquote handle that call or make contact with someone after they've called 911. They're a resource for police to use. They are able to complete the appropriate paperwork to place someone on emergency psychiatric detention, but they are a resource at this point. They assist us once the scene is sterile and once they're able to complete paperwork. But it's a unit that definitely bears some looking into at the county level to make more robust. They carry radios that can communicate with the police. Haven't had a use for that quite yet, but they spend the majority of their time in the city of Oakland, and we're usually waiting for them to in the 2 or 3 occasions we've used them, they're responding from the city of Oakland, and I believe it's just 2 at a time, 2 individuals.
Okay. This person asks they say that a key requirement for officers is judgment. What are police standards in bias by proxy incidents? I'm not sure if that person that asked that question wants to clarify or add a little bit of detail.
I'm not familiar with bias by proxy as a concept. Just we'll talk about staffing on Monday, but certainly there are state standards for psychological screening for all police officers, and I realize that's not going to get necessarily to the heart of this question, but just understand as part of the background, as part of the review process for hiring police officers, making sure that they have the mental faculties to, for emotional intelligence, being able to make good sound decisions and those kinds of things.
Okay, and then another follow-up to the question before about the mobile units that are from the county's behavioral health department. Are those readily available, and what is the response time? And I think you talked about how they're not readily available because sometimes they're out in the open. But do we have an idea of response time?
We had a prolonged incident on the east end of town 2 or 3 years ago. Very prolonged. It was like a 7 or 8 hour incident. And I want to say it took over an hour for their response. And at that point, we had mobilized so many officers. It was safe and again, sterile enough for them to try to assist us. And then the incident that Captain McMullen and I worked probably last year, I believe it was a 30 or 40 minute response. They were on another incident, again, outside of Alameda, and they responded at that point. So again, great resource if you have the ability to slow it down. If it's not an immediate crisis incident, great resource to have.
Okay, great. Next question. There's mention of body cam footage being randomly viewed. This person is asking, how often does it happen? Does it happen more often for officers involved in previous incidents? Who is the footage shared with, and what mechanisms for discipline are in place if an inappropriate incident is viewed in one of these random viewings?
So I'll tackle the front half of that at least. We encourage all of our lieutenants and our managers and our sergeants, for that matter, to look into body worn camera footage periodically, to watch their officers, to ensure that we are complying with policy, and also to provide some training and some constructive criticism, if you will, on calls for service. They capture such an enormous amount of information, from response to the way we speak to folks to our physical actions. And I would suggest that we are looking at those often. I would say probably even daily, from different supervision levels and the officers themselves. One of the great things about it is it's like a reel that you could watch over and over again, and dissect and truly critique not only yourself, but your supervisors, to provide input and analysis. And so that happens daily. And if something is observed that isn't quite right, we encourage and expect our lieutenants and our supervisors to correct, lead, guide, and assist our officers to improve in any manner they see fit.
So the previous, we talked about, the question was about the judgment being a key requirement for officers. And then they asked, what is the police standards for bias by proxy incidents? I think this would be for Lieutenant Daraspini. An additional comment came in that says profiling by proxy. This problem can arise when police officers rely on the emergency dispatcher's recitation of what a biased caller claims to have happened, instead of making an independent and professional assessment of the caller's claims.
Yeah, and again, I'm not sure that there's an answer that you could give that would answer that.
Okay.
Obviously, the communication center gets calls from a variety of people in our community, outside of our community, that report their observations. And those observations could be as simple as, I see someone that looks like they're breaking into a car, to I see someone that I believe is in crisis. At that point, it's going to still be on that officer, no matter what is written on their mobile data terminal in the car, or what they're hearing on the police radio as they're getting dispatched to a call. It is up to that individual officer to still make a call, a judgment call, when they get to the call they're going to. And all I could really say about that is besides the pre-screening questionnaires and psychological screening and polygraph screening pre-employment, the police academy is a 30-week grinder of nonstop, both prolonged and snap decision judgment calls that are being analyzed by the academy staff, whether it's operating an emergency vehicle, using a firearm, making use of force decision, and making detention and arrest decisions. So it's a culmination of all that. And it's really unique to that officer. That's the best I can answer. We don't just blindly listen to the police radio or read what's on the mobile data terminal and make decisions based on what the dispatcher or the caller says. Sometimes it's a little more forward, that's something that we need to get to if it's a hot call in progress, but there's still judgment calls at the other end of that police radio.
Got it. The next question is this: going back to procedure for resisting arrest, which we had talked about on Tuesday, how can one be arrested solely for resisting if there was no originating reason to put someone in handcuffs? This person had asked this question and it wasn't answered fully on Tuesday. When during an arrest are you required to let someone know what they are being arrested for, or are you required to let them know that? And how can someone be arrested only for resisting if there is no other charge?
Well, you can still delay, obstruct, or resist a police officer who has, for instance, a traffic stop, right? There's legal reason. It's an infraction. It's not something you would be arrested for, but you have an obligation to pull over, to stop, to, under California law, identify yourself, all of these things. And the good news is the majority of that time, that goes without conflict for both the citizen and the police officer. However, it doesn't always go that way. And in fact, one of the most dangerous things a police officer can do is pull a car over. You have no idea what you're walking up on, and many police officers killed in line of duty on what were otherwise deemed quote unquote routine traffic stops. If a person, and in my 30 years, I've seen it run the gamut, right? The person who pulls over to the right and then immediately jumps out and starts running. So that is 148 of the penal code. That is resisting, delaying a police officer. And if I give chase and make that arrest, and all I stopped them for was the taillight, and they just didn't want to identify themselves for the taillight, and there were no other charges, I'm only going to arrest them for 148 of the penal code for resisting and delaying. I've had people throw my pen. I've had people throw the cite book out the window into the traffic lane as, I guess, a bit of a protest. And that could be a 148 resisting arrest. So that is how someone could be arrested and charged with simply a 148. The conversation we had the other night is, we don't like those. We don't want that to happen. We try desperately to avoid those by using techniques and whatnot to try to get people to comply, to get through the business we need to take care of. Like I like to tell people a lot, look, you may believe the officer was absolutely wrong in every way. The officer was biased. The officer was a jerk. All of these things. Please comply at the scene of the stop. Please do the things that the officer is asking you to do, and then please come in and file a complaint. And I'll tell you that certainly in the Alameda Police Department, we will investigate that complaint and we will look into it thoroughly. I assure you that as the chief of police. But please comply out at the scene for your safety and the safety of the officer. But that is how someone can be arrested. Those are some anecdotal stories of how someone can be arrested for resisting, delaying a police officer without another underlying charge or misdemeanor charge. Now they can quickly escalate. You go to stop that person and they take a swing at you, those kinds of things. So those are added charges, but those are the simple ways that a 148 arrest, which is the penal code section for resisting arrest or delaying a peace officer, that's how those things can happen.
Thank you. The next question asks, do you know when the last time the screening tests for police officers have been reviewed for bias?
Are they talking about the initial hiring process? I'm
not sure. The person who asked that question, yes, they clarified. Yes, they are. Thank you.
Well, I'm probably the most recent hiree here. So in my 6 weeks, you need to know that even as the chief of police, I too went through the full psychological background that all police officers by state law have to. And then I specifically went through what Alameda police officers have to go through. And I can tell you, I met with a psychologist. I went through a battery of tests. We talked about things like bias and whatnot. So yeah, we're all going through it, even me.
Great. And then I think I just have one more question that I'll ask, and people are welcome to continue to add questions, or then I can turn it back over to you, Al. But the last question is, what are the disciplinary standards for holding an officer accountable for incidents where too much force was used or someone was arrested unlawfully?
Lieutenant Crosby needs to be unmuted.
Oh, apologies.
Yes, now I am. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was giving me trouble. Just like I talked about before, it's the same standards. If there's some misconduct with excessive use of force, either by a citizen through a personnel complaint or by a lieutenant or supervisor reviewing an incident, body-worn camera, can also start an internal complaint. Same process, fill out the complaint form. It's shot up through the chain of command and then forwarded over to the inspectional services sergeant for investigation. And it's just the same investigation like I explained before. Go through all the steps process and then have a finding at the end of that.
Sarah, I might add on that. You know, there's been a lot of talk in the news about a duty to report, a duty to intervene between police officers. And I certainly understand that conversation. I understand where there have been failures. But I can also tell you that in my career, I've seen a lot of heroic work by police officers who intervened, who saw that, for instance, police officers who maybe had been in a fight or had been hit, and to get that person out of the way so that the cooler heads could prevail. I've seen police officers report other police officers for excessive force, and we have initiated investigations. So it's not just supervisors and managers who have done that, but police officers as well, and of course citizens and whatnot. So I understand again the concerns, the ugly incidents that we've seen, but I can also tell you that there's been heroic work and people who have come forward, and I personally, as a chief of police, have held people accountable for excessive force, and I can think of one that stands out in my mind dramatically. That all started with one police officer coming in and saying what I saw was not right, and launched an investigation. And so that happens as well.
Got it. Well, thank you. I think that we have gotten through all of the questions. We have a little bit of time left. So if it's okay, I could go back to some of the questions that we had outstanding from the other day, or we could, Al, you could take it back over. What do you think, Al? Oh, Al, you should be able to unmute yourself.
I think it's fine to go over the questions from last time. I did, however, want to just, our structure's been somewhat rigid. So if there's anything that the officers feel that we need to understand about policing, obviously, because it's something that none of us have experience with, or very few of us have experience with, that they can share that with us, specifically related to these topics, but to other topics as well. I'm sure that there are aspects of the job we don't understand. What do they think that we need to know that is not, they haven't been able to communicate?
I appreciate that, Alan, I'll start. And I tried to express it a little bit last week. The reality is, especially in a city like Alameda, the average police officer is rarely going to use force, thankfully. Frankly, they're rarely going to be in much of a confrontation. And that's not to say that that doesn't happen. It's not to say our police officers aren't prepared and well trained, but they're well disciplined. And we have a great community that we police as well. And so, but that's not to say conflict doesn't happen. That's not to say people don't cause problems, that they don't not just resist arrest, but resist compliance in any way. And I look to my friends in other disciplines, such as education, and they talk about public discourse in classrooms where there's open defiance. And I talk to friends, they're clergy that normally would never have had in their careers, open defiance from parishioners. And certainly we talked a little bit last time about workplace violence, where people not just having conflict, but trying to solve their conflict through violence and other violent means. And so that is the reality. What you see in the world, whatever is happening in society, that is where the police are interjected into, trying to help, trying to bring calm to chaotic situations. So I actually don't look for a lot of sympathy. I don't look for, we signed up for it. It'd be like a fireman complaining about going into a burning building. You might have known that was going to happen when you signed up. And I believe that's what we signed up for, is we say, hey, send us. We are prepared to go into chaos and bring calm to chaos and help people in their worst moments. But it's a people business. It's a human business, and we deal with human beings. One of the dramatic differences between a police officer and a firefighter, in terms of two extremely dangerous jobs, and firefighting is an extremely dangerous job, but our adversary has an independent will. The firefighter's adversary follows the laws of physics and chemistry and thermodynamics, and those brave men and women still go in, and God bless them for doing it, and I'm glad they do. The police officer takes on an adversary with an independent will, and ours is defense. Our job is defensive by nature, and so we are continually behind the 8 ball, and that's why I talk about when I mentioned the 148, the resisting arrest. I cannot tell you how many times I ended up in a position where I ended up having to put hands on someone, handcuff somebody who I did not. That was the last thing I wanted to do. I wanted to get through this call for service. I wanted to get through writing a ticket for maybe a minor traffic violation. And I had to react solely based on the conduct of the person I was dealing with. And so when we look to the police, look, we are an arm of the government. We absolutely deserve scrutiny. Anytime the government uses force, especially deadly force, that deserves the highest level of scrutiny that society can present, because that is that serious. But we have been also entrusted with the right to, or the duty to bring people to justice, to protect victims, to protect public safety. And so it's a two-way street. And we should be held to account. We should be held to a very, very high standard. But we have to see that many times we are thrust into situations where, again, a little bit of cooperation would have gone a long way and would have prevented a lot of incidents from happening. And that can't always be on the police. That sometimes we have to take responsibility as society, as parents, as just citizens, that we have a responsibility. I've heard it often said that on the one coast we have the Statue of Liberty, and maybe on the opposite coast we should have erected the Statue of Responsibility, because to be in a free society means we have to be responsible as citizens. And so it's a two-way street. And so I feel a little bit like I'm preaching to the choir here, because this is a group of responsible citizens who are taking an active role in their government and in their police department. And I once again commend you for that. And I hope and trust that as you look at these things, that you look at it with a very, very broad lens and look at all of society and how our interactions, how our discourse, our public discourse is, especially as it relates to modern day policing.
Thank you for that. One follow-up from something you said earlier, Chief Fenn, about fair criticisms of police. Can you expand on other areas in general, what you see that also constitute fair criticisms of police?
I think before I mentioned about us being sometimes slow to respond, I think, or slow to change. Again, it's kind of a governmental thing sometimes. I think we have traditionally relied too much on experience and not enough on data to look at the things that we do, because now we know, for instance, the DARE program. I don't know if some of you may remember the DARE program, Drug Abuse Resistance Education. Well, that was widely accepted in cities and jurisdictions throughout America, and it seemed like a really good program. Well, studies were eventually done and found that depending on how it was done, many of those programs actually did harm, that actually drug abuse went up if there was a DARE program. Well, that had to be proven through empirical data. And so fortunately now we're in a period of time where we have connected more with the academic world, and we are subjecting ourselves to examination, to studies, academic studies, reviewing data, and hopefully that will do much to improve us. And as we learn about things like unconscious or implicit bias, not just in police officers, but in society in general, that can only go to improving the service we deliver and just us as people. So my hope is, and that's what I was talking about, I'm sorry that some of these things have gotten to this point before we've moved the needle farther. My hope is that this kind of experience that we're doing here helps us to move the needle farther and faster.
Thank you. Quick question from this person is asking, they want to know what police are instructed to do if they do not want to provide personal information when stopped, as that is their right.
Well, it's not always their right. Like if they're driving a motor vehicle in the state of California, they are obligated to present a driver's license to identify themselves. And there are other times where they are absolutely obligated to identify themselves. So again, that's another one of those. It's a misnomer that it's automatically right that you don't have to identify yourself. And we can't possibly cover every instance here where you are required by law. But I think that's one question that is fair for people to ask. Officer, am I being detained? When officers say, may I talk to you? Am I being detained? And the officer should answer that and should answer that truthfully. And if you're not being detained, then you're free to go. That's called a consensual encounter. You are encounter and you're free to go. If the officer says you are being detained, then you need to comply with the orders of that officer because they have the power of law behind them to compel you to stop. And so, you know, that's why I like to say at that moment, if you think the officer is absolutely wrong, I implore you to comply and then come see us and make a complaint. And I promise that we will absolutely look into that.
Great, thank you for that. For you, Chief Henn, and for all of the APD representatives who are here today, do you see a civilian oversight committee as beneficial or burdensome? And would having an oversight committee have an effect on recruitment?
That's a good question. I don't know. That's one that I think is actually worthy of some actual study of how it affects recruitment. I think the civilian oversight, unfortunately, now runs such a gamut. It's hard to know, to just say civilian oversight, know exactly what's being referred to. There's independent police auditors, there's true citizen review boards, there's police commissions. There's a number of different models out there. I do not believe they are one size fits all by any stretch of the imagination. So I think any community that wants to go down that road, I just think it needs to be a very thoughtful process. I think it needs to be examined. What is the goal? What is the entity that's pushing for it, hoping to achieve with it, and then what's the best way to achieve those goals, and what would fit with the particular community. Because I think to reject it out of hand, this might be someplace where is policing wrong, or where is policing been slow to change, and that is to dismiss civilian oversight out of hand. I mean, one of our hallmarks as a free society is that we have civilian oversight of the military. That's important. That distinguishes us from much of the rest of the world. And so I don't think we should automatically fear it, as probably many in my profession have over the years, but I don't think it should be used as a political tool either, to unnecessarily restrict the abilities of the police department or the police officers to do their job. And that's why I think thoughtful people who come together and decide what needs to be accomplished, and the best way to accomplish it is the best way to do any public policy, frankly, much less police civilian oversight.
A follow-up question to that: do you have a recommendation on a model for oversight?
Not at this time, and again, I don't see one size fits all, like I mentioned, and so it would be bold of me in 6 weeks to try to tell you exactly what Alameda needs. So, and it's not just from the police department, right? It's from the city council, other civic organizations. So there would need to be a lot of discussion and input before we found what was right, if something was right for the city of Alameda.
All right, so we're through all of the questions that we received tonight. And then so going back to Tuesday, where we started to talk about policies, I have a couple of questions. The first one I think we talked about, but I'm just going to ask it again. I think it was just a repeat though. What is the policy for placing officers on administrative leave?
Well, I have the authority to do so, and I can let the captains jump at any point they want to. There's it's sometimes a very simple decision. I mean, it's so obvious that it needs to happen. Other times, it's a more difficult decision. I think and maybe Alan from the city attorney's office may want to chime in at some point about the particular laws that govern peace officers in California. That, you know, some of these high-profile incidents, for instance, that we've seen throughout the country, where you hear that a police chief, an incident happened on Friday, and on Monday the police chief is firing people. That does not occur in California. Our law just does not provide for that. So, and again, maybe this is a good time, Alan, if you want to jump in and give some commentary on that.
Right. I mean, police officers in particular under the Police Officers Bill of Rights have due process rights, have by law are entitled to a fair hearing if they're accused of misconduct. Administrative leave there's a lot of nuance here, and it really does ultimately sort of depend upon the individual facts of what the accusation is. I can tell you just from having been involved, over the years in both here and in other cities, when an officer or when any city employee is accused of misconduct, I think HR and legal get together and have a discussion. HR, legal, and the involved department will get together, have a discussion, and determine, is it appropriate? Is it necessary for the organization? What type of leave can the individual employee be put on? Sometimes they're put on paid administrative leave. Very rarely people are put on unpaid leave, but that's a disciplinary process that really it only occurs after sort of the progressive disciplinary process is instituted. The department has investigated the allegations. So it really does. I know people hate the typical lawyer response. It depends, but it really does depend upon the individual factual allegations involving the accusation of misconduct.
Thank you for that. All right, going back up to the questions from the other day. Actually, Chief, you started talking about this earlier. California driver's licenses have been issued with 3 gender options since January 2019. Yet when filling out an online or in-person police report, only 2 gender options are listed by the driver's license number and issuing state. When will this be updated to be in compliance with the current law?
I can't tell you for sure. I presume as we move into a new records management system that that we'll see those changes, but yeah, it's as much a software issue as anything.
Lieutenant Daraspini, did you want to say?
Yeah, we're gonna have to look into that entire portal when we go to our new records management system to make sure that there's still communication between the online reporting system and the traditional reporting system. So that is definitely something we can look at when that bridge gets crossed here in a couple months. But it's worth noting, and it's on a to-do list already.
Great, thank you. The next question is, you've supplied data around the frequency of use of force, but can you also supply data around the use of restraints generally, the use of restraints against juveniles, the frequency of use of spit hoods and wrap restraints, and how often restraints are used in conjunction with mental health related calls?
I can speak to that. That was one of the information requests that came through. That is not currently a subsection that we collect data on. When just standard restraints are used, it does not rise to the level of a reportable use of force, be it traditional handcuffs, waist chains, leg shackles, the wrap restraint device, spit hoods, and then that's not something we document for adults or juveniles. If it is just a traditional restraint system with no other level of resistance, no other use of physical force, we do not document that and maintain that record.
The next question is, at the League of Women Voters Forum, which was maybe about a month or so ago, it was reported that that no APD officer had fired a weapon in the past 15 years. Does the police department maintain records of how often officers draw their firearms?
I can answer that. Since 2016 or 17, we have been keeping track of what we call a weapon display, which is pointing a firearm or a taser at an individual. We do keep those records, but merely drawing a firearm, if you just draw like building search and you're not pointing at anybody, we don't keep track of those. but we do keep track of if we pointed at somebody with a firearm or a taser.
And I would like to add at least to that is stored in the same system with red flag warnings and goes through a similar but not as inclusive process as of use of force, where a manager is looking at that before those get stored in that database.
Thank you. When a police officer records information such as age or race, how is that information gathered? Is this a matter of police identification or is it self-identification? And if the police are making that identification, what reason is there for not allowing self-identification?
I can speak to that as well. I think it's going to be case by case. A lot of times, if someone has their car broken into, they're victimized by something, it's not uncommon for them to identify themselves with a California state issued driver's license, to which an officer would collect data. If that was part of the loss, for example, if their purse is in the car and they don't have one of those things, there's nothing that precludes an officer from getting that data from them and having them self-identify. Now, as the chief was alluding to, there are certain situations where you need to identify yourself, and that identification needs to be verified, especially if you're looking at making someone eligible for a cite and release from the scene of a minor crime. In those cases, we can't allow someone to self-identify because unfortunately, sometimes people are not truthful with us, and we may need to verify that information via a records check or a check on our mobile data terminal. But there's nothing that says that it must be absolutely identified in person, again, unless one of those circumstances is met where you shall identify yourself to the government, essentially.
And then going back to the question on drawing a weapon, I think this is a follow-up to that. Somebody asked if people self-report though, if officers self-report those.
Yes, they are required to report to their supervisor anytime they point their firearm or taser at somebody.
Okay. And then, sorry, I'm getting a couple more questions in. This next person, and again, we'll have a hard stop at 8:30, so I'll just take a few more questions. This person says, my experience is that APD is not an agency that physically abuses people. It has been an agency that has made people of color feel very uncomfortable. It is known for this throughout the Bay Area. This person has many friends who will not come to Alameda because they expect to be harassed. This is the flip side of being there for the community. If you are perceived of being other, i.e. not of the community, then you can be subject to some very unpleasant treatment. It can be as simple as addressing as hey man or hey dude rather than sir or madam. Is APD doing anything to change this perception or practice? Are you familiar with the idea of procedural justice, which is essentially just the idea of treating people with respect and in a just manner during interactions? Maybe for the chief.
Yeah, I'll start. So yes, and over the years, I've heard those things as well. Frankly, I'm an East Bay kid, and I don't want anybody to feel that way, and I don't think anybody that you're seeing here tonight wants people to feel that way either. One of the things, and I think the question, I think it was a fair question, Sarah, as I understood it being read, because the person recognized that you got a nice community here. And that means a lot of times people call the police, and Captain Emmett mentioned it earlier. We have the ability to go to a lot of calls, and that means people will call the police. And so there's a lot of proactive enforcement to try to keep a nice community, to try to keep the crime rate low. Well, unfortunately, that means, again, that goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Sometimes that means conflict. Sometimes that means we ended up stopping somebody who maybe either shouldn't have been stopped, or it turned out to be a misidentification, what have you. And now we're learning more about maybe it was somebody who called in and was biased in their call to begin with. I think we're learning these things as a profession. I think we're learning this as a police department. We're learning from procedural justice. We're training those concepts. We're trying to practice those same concepts within the confines of the police department as well, and the way we treat our employees, because we believe that some of what's come out of procedural justice, the way you treat employees inside the building, will have a direct correlation to the way they treat the public outside the building. So, yeah, I think we're certainly open to those things. I think we're trying to embrace those things. The people that I've met so far in my time here in Alameda have been high caliber people that are clearly smart, well educated, and are very service oriented. And I think that's a real feather in the cap to the city of Alameda. And I think if we were to rest on our laurels, however, and believe that, well, we've got it, we're on to something else now, well, of course, that would be a huge mistake. And I think it's these kind of processes that we have to go through to make sure that we're upholding our end of the bargain.
Thank you.
Public trust.
Okay, so here's the last question, and it's pretty long, so I'm just going to read it as it is. The commission could learn about and then advocate for non-police resources to join the toolkit of response professionals to 911 calls and be the representatives of the community to oversee and inform from a non-police officer's perspective when police review potential violations of a police officer code of conduct. And third, provide a community process that builds trust that is necessary for all members of the community to react to our police in ways that the police want when they're trying to do their job. Can the chief comment on the pros and cons that police have when considering joining a department that has a civilian oversight commission?
Well, again, I think I covered a lot of that, but I guess I would also say this is that I think anybody looking for a job, regardless of where it is, but certainly now in these days, if you're looking for a law enforcement job, you want to know that the place is fair, that you have a supportive community, that you can go and you can grow in that place, you can be a part of the community, and that you're valued. And that, there's oftentimes that there's this notion that it's us versus them, the police versus the community. And I think there's also sometimes a notion of the community versus the police. And, is this the kind of place that's going to welcome me? Is this the kind of place, I'll be honest with you, as a police chief hiring when I was in Fairfield, I had lateral officers come from other communities that said, I didn't feel supported anymore in this community. I loved being a police officer in city such and such, but I didn't feel supported anymore. So it is a bit of a two-way street. So whatever oversight, whether it be from the city council, city manager, and police chief, or there's a police auditor or a civilian review board, the hallmark has to be fairness, and that it's a supportive environment, both for the community as well as the police officer trying to serve the community.
Thank you. And that's our last question. We do have the information about the meeting on Monday, November 16th at 6 p.m. It's on our website. There's a link to it. It's also on the Facebook page. And with that, I wanted to turn things back over to you, Al.
Thanks very much. I'll just make it really quick. I want to thank all of the members of APD for being here and for answering these questions. It's greatly appreciated. I think that the thing that we can do that is most likely to result in success is for us all to listen to each other and to learn from each other, and do it in a respectful manner that we have been doing it. And and I think that that's going to lead to success. I hope that these three forums that we're having will be the beginning of a conversation that will continue between the police department and the public. I think that if we do exactly what we've been doing, improve on this, be some fantastic improvement. Thanks very much. See you on Monday.
Thank you, everyone. See you Monday, 6 o'clock.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone.